There's definitely a serious aspect of anti-Semitism in the anti-Israel, pro-Palestine marches. Would you not agree?
Social media poisons our brains a little bit. You have millions of interactions every day in real life, but one viral moment that can be taken out of context can be used to paint a very simplified portrait of a political group.
It seems to me that the ideology is that they think that the whole territory is theirs. I just wouldn't believe that there would be a Palestinian state where they wouldn't want to attack and try and reclaim. So they would take the sovereignty, but then they would build up arms to try and recapture the whole land. I don't understand. If I was running Israel, I would certainly not take the risk that that's what was going to happen.
Well, Winston, I think this is where we fundamentally disagree here, because they've already taken the risk. You can't travel from Gaza. If you're a fisherman that goes beyond a few hundred meters of the sea to fish and feed your family, the Israeli Navy shoots you. All the money that is even provided by Qatar in humanitarian aid has to pass through Israel first. They get to approve every piece of good that goes in and out. It's not a sovereign country. You go on these kind of junkets, for lack of a better term, especially as a journalist or as someone in the media, everyone's trying to spin you. And it's basically a lot of lies of omission. You can walk around parts of Hebron in the West Bank where there are streets where Palestinians are not allowed to walk. There are Palestinian homes where they have to leave out of a window on the back of their building because the front door is part of a segregated street. They shouldn't face any repercussions. They should have free speech rights. But if you post that type of content as a Palestinian, you're sent to prison. There are two standards, and it seems to be based on ethnicity and race. Is that on the table? Is that what the Israeli politicians have proposed? I haven't seen it once. They want to invoke World War II in terms of destroying Dresden, but they don't want to invoke World War II for what happened after. The big takeaway is that they're the same people.
I just can't accept that they're the same people. They're not the same people.
We had this debate in America.
It's a completely different debate in America.
It's no different. Societies can't integrate. It's a self-fulfilling prophecy if you obsess over our ethnic differences.
Hello and welcome to the Winston Marshall Show with me, Winston Marshall. I had the pleasure of sitting down with a good friend, investigative journalist Lee Fang. Lee and I have spoken before when I was at Marshall Matters, but this is his first time on the Winston Marshall Show, and specifically we got into the Israel-Palestine question. Now, a lot of you viewers have rightly pointed out that I haven't had much diversity of opinion on this issue. It has been hard to find pro-Palestine voices. I was very happy when Lee said he agreed to coming and talking with me, agreed to discussing it. We disagreed on a lot, but we found common ground. And I hope that this was a constructive conversation despite this disagreeing. We discussed what's going on in Israel and Gaza. We also discussed the history and possible future of the conflict. We also talked about what's going on campuses across America. All of that and much, much more before you listen to Lee. If you want to help me, if you want to help this channel, all I ask, please, is you press the subscribe button. If you press the subscribe button, I'm going to have more phenomenal guests like Lee Fang discussing the issues you want to hear about. But without further ado, Lee Fang. Thank you for watching the Winston Marshall Show. Lee, thank you for coming back and talking to me.
Good to see you, Winston.
So we were just both sharing a panel at Dissident Dialogues in Brooklyn. We're here in New York. That was a couple of days ago. We were talking about censorship. And in fact, the entire panel, we were also up there with Alex Gutentag, another leading investigative journalist in America, as well as Jacob Siegel. And we found common ground on the recent anti-Semitism awareness act that's been passed through Congress, led by Republicans, led by the right, and the danger it had to free speech in America. I'd love to get into that, and although we maybe not go too much into that, but I want to set up to explain to our audience a little bit about this conversation. So a few months ago, you text me and say, actually, I think when it comes to Israel-Palestine stuff, we disagree. And you should know that on my side, I have invited pro-Palestine voices onto the show, but it's been hard. It's been hard to have them on. So I'm keen to have diversity of opinion on the show and keen to have your opinion on all of that. And another thing that I think you and I have discussed is that there's such a lack of constructive conversations when it comes to Israel-Palestine. When particularly in the media, you'll see these flary, spicy fights online, but it doesn't actually push anything forward. It doesn't really feel that nourishing necessary. So I'm hoping we can attempt such a conversation.
No, that's right. I mean, definitely not nourishing the intellectually stimulating or thoughtful side of the brain. It's a lot of the same kind of social media driven extremism where, both sides boil down to name calling and sectarianism, and it becomes very ugly very quickly. I mean, I kind of hate discussing this issue. It's a lot like the immigration debate where there are valid concerns on both sides, but ultimately, the extremists win the day, and that's what you see represented in the media. Israel and Palestine is just so similar. And, I don't want to say that I'm an expert or that I'm a partisan on this, but it's touched me. It's touched all of us, especially since October 7th, and it's affected me. I'm an American who writes about foreign policy. I write about free speech. I care about human rights and human dignity. So even though this debate annoys me, I'm glad that you're participating and you had me on, so I appreciate it.
Why does it annoy you?
Well, it's just the dynamic that you just referenced, that the loudest voices get the most retweets. There's an ugliness and a tribal nature to both sides, and generally speaking, it's the latest saga of our free speech debates that are very unhealthy for the concepts of free expression and the First Amendment. Just like as we had 10 years or so of leftist attempts to weaponize bigotry accusations and shut down their opponents, to take a complex situation, complex public policy problem like policing or crime or education achievement in America, and dumb it down with saying, hey, anyone who questions the leftist approach is a bigot, and we're going to brand you a bigot, and we're going to separate you from the public square, or stigmatize you from the debate, in an attempt to shut down nuanced conversation on any of these subjects. We're seeing that same dynamic play out again with Israel-Palestine. That, of course, there are white supremacist racists, there are neo-Nazis, but for the most part, America is not a racist country, and that same dynamic you're seeing here. Of course, there are anti-Semites, but the vast majority of people demonstrating and who care about this issue, who discuss this issue, are not motivated by Jew hatred, right? And we're seeing this attempt to weaponize the charge of anti-Semitism to shut down speech.
Let's look at then in America. You say the vast majority are not motivated by Jew hatred.
Sure.
But there is a lot of Jew hatred. And if you look at what's I think it was only last week where Jews with wearing Magen David have been not let onto university campuses by protesters. They're being stopped at the gates. It's not even apparent that they're pro-Israel. They just happen to be Jewish. There's definitely a serious aspect of anti-Semitism in the anti-Israel or pro-Palestine marches. Would you not agree?
I don't know the degree. The social media poisons our brains a little bit in that you have millions of interactions every day in real life, but one viral moment that can be taken out of context can be used to paint a very, simplified portrait of a political group. I've seen some, efforts. And I don't really know because I wasn't I haven't really been to all of these demonstrations. I don't want to interpret them without being there, but I've seen a lot of bad faith interpretations of these protests. I've been to a couple. I was on Capitol Hill in October interviewing lawmakers on a separate issue, and I had no idea there was a gigantic Jewish Voices for Peace protest, leftist protest, calling for a ceasefire, calling for an end of the conflict. And I spent a few hours with them, interviewed people, walked with them around Capitol Hill. They marched from the mall to Congress. I didn't see a hint of any anti-Semitism, and indeed it was led by Jews. But you look at the press coverage, pro-Israel voices calling them all anti-Semites, saying that they're motivated by Jewish hatred. I mean, from what I could tell, that they were making this up out of thin air. I suspect that this is the dynamic across the board. Now, I'm not saying that there aren't anti-Semites. Of course there are anti-Semites. But we saw this dynamic with Black Lives Matter, with the trans debate, that anyone who discussed gender biology, about the kind of efficacy of giving hormones to children, they were branded as bigots, as hateful people who wanted a trans genocide. But as you've interviewed many of the people who are interested in this issue, the majority of activists and experts and feminists who are concerned in raising questions about providing hormones or gender therapy to children do not want a trans genocide, right? The majority of people who are concerned about public safety and depolicing with abolish the police, these were not white supremacists. Were there some, anti-black racists among the mix? Of course. This is a big country. But I'm not just reflexively against the idea that there are anti-Semites. Of course there are. But I'm very familiar of this pattern of weaponizing the accusation.
Why do you think that this conflict, the current Israel-Hamas conflict, indeed, whenever it flares up in that region, why does this inspire such protests on the streets compared to other conflicts? Compared to Ukraine, Russia? I'm not saying that there wasn't. I myself went in London to see the Ukraine protests at the Russian embassy. I've seen them there, but it's another level when it comes to Israel-Palestine. Why do you think that is?
Partially because the U.S. is involved in a way that it's, I've heard from many that there's a hypocrisy, a double standard, because there are many other alleged genocides or ethnic cleansings around the world. In Sudan, there's the Janjaweed militias engaging in mass rape, violence, and ethnic killing. In Myanmar, there's the ethnic slaughter of the Rohingya people. Where are the protests there? That's what's the charge. Well, look how the U.S. operates. The U.S. sanctions the Janjaweed militia leaders. They say that no weapons, no support, no financial transfers to the people accused of those atrocities. The U.S. sanctions the Myanmar government.
Yeah, but the U.S. has just given $60 billion to Ukraine. I don't see... The accusation there is a little bit different, right? For one country engaging in a ethnic slaughter of its minority population, Ukraine's a little bit different. This is a war, between two nation states. But in terms of the accusation of a nation state going after its minority ethnic population. So wait, you're referring explicitly there to Israel going after... You're calling it ethnic slaughter?
Yeah.
What's happening in Gaza? Okay. So can you explain that to me? Why do you disagree with the notion that it's not ethnic slaughter?
Well, let's back up on what what's going on in Israel. Because I talk to people about this, and there's just a disagreement in terminology and history on basic facts on the ground, right? 1967, Israel launches a war, expands its territory by 300%, seizes Jerusalem, West Bank, Gaza, Golan Heights, Sinai Peninsula. Stupendous, incredible military victory, right? They take these territories. Some of those territories they've given back in their peace treaty with Egypt, but generally speaking, most of those territories are part of Israel. I think we can all agree on that. The question here is, what do they do with the people who are part of Israel but not given the same rights as other Israelis? And they seem to not be given rights based on their ethnic identity.
who are those? The Gazans.
Yeah,
So you think
the
Gaza's part of Israel, or
It is. They conquered it. Like that's what happened.
so we're talking about 1967.
Yeah, since 1967 they seized Gaza. That's part of Israel. They control the borders. They control what goes on there, right?
Well, until Hamas took control in 2000, until 2008. Well, yes.
Well, in 2005,
2005. Sorry.
Controversial decision, but Israel left Gaza in terms of the active policing on the streets and the military occupation, similar to what still goes on today in the West Bank. But they maintained control of the borders. And they immediately started a military blockade. They decide what goes in and goes out of the country. They control the travel. Every few years they bomb.
As well as Egypt.
They work with Egypt in terms of controlling the border. But it's a walled territory where there are automated machine guns facing inwards. This is not a free state. This is controlled by Israel. We've seen in the last few months Israeli politicians saying that they want to dispense of the Palestinian population. Danny Danon and other members of Likud have said that they want to get rid of all 2 million people in that territory, and that Europe and America and other countries should take them as refugees on an ethnic basis. They're not getting rid of Jews, right? They're getting rid of the Palestinians who live there. So, when I see...
Well, doesn't that represent the extreme side of the Israeli?
Well, that's the government. That's Likud. That's the majority in power. And just generally in terms of terms here, like, when I hear people on the left and the right or pro-Israel, pro-Palestine talk about the country, they're often yelling at each other, saying, making claims. And Israel is a paradox because there are many things true all at once, right? For 60% of the population of Israel, it's a democratic Western country with incredible free speech rights, very vibrant media, wonderful universal health care, elected and representative government and civic institutions that really take care of its people and promote, entrepreneurship and business and travel. And for about 40% of the population, the 2 million people in Gaza, about 3 million Palestinians who live in the West Bank, and about 300,000 people who live in East Jerusalem, they don't have those same rights.
You're calling that Israel?
Well, all of it's controlled by Israel, right? Like, their military controls those borders. You can't enter any of those territories without Israel's approval. So when one side says, this is a horrible ethnic dictatorship, it's true for 1/3 of the population. When one side says it's a wonderful Western democracy, it's true for 2/3 of the population. Both can be true at the same time. And I think that's the kind of root cause of this conflict.
Rather than what happened on October 7th.
Well, that's the latest development in this war that's existed since 1967.
You don't go before 1967. You start it at 1967.
Well, you can always go back in this conflict. And this conflict,
Well, the reason I say that is because one classic rejoinder to people who start the conversation on October 7th, they say, well, it didn't start on October 7th, right? But then, so that's curious that you would go to 1967 and not before that. Why would you choose 1967?
Well, that's when Israel conquered Gaza.
Right, but let's say many of pro-Palestine...
If Gaza was still part of Egypt or its own sovereign state and it launched an attack on Israel, this would be a different argument, right? Like, that's war, and Israel would be in its right to wage war against another sovereign state if it's attacked. I don't think there's any problem there. But this is a caged minority population. That's already controlled by Israel. It's not the same as two states going after each other.
Do you think what happened on October 7th was a war crime?
Yeah, any violence against civilians is a war crime.
Mm-hmm. So in response to October 7th, what do you think the leadership of Israel should do or should have done? And seeing as you're calling it ethnic slaughter, what would be an appropriate response for them?
Look, I don't know the exact response. I don't blame... It's just kind of It's human psychology to want revenge after, your family members are murdered. We've had year after year of Israelis shooting into Gaza and killing civilians. In 2019, there was something like 3,000 to 4,000 Gazans who were sniped during the march of return by Israeli snipers standing at the guard towers shooting into the territory. What happened on October 7th is a human atrocity. I totally understand the urge for revenge and retribution, but there's a big difference between fighting for security, and fighting for a lasting peace. I don't really understand, and I followed this debate very closely, what Israel's strategy here is, and I would love to hear if what's your perception of it. Is the idea here that for people in Gaza, killing thousands and thousands of children and women, that their family members will strive for a peaceful coexistence, still with unequal rights and no sovereignty, and as stateless beings? I don't see it. You look at ethnic sectarian warfare, at least in the last 100 years of the 20th century, a military solution hasn't worked, right? Look at Rwanda. Look at the breakup of Yugoslavia. If you don't give people rights, if you don't kind of recognize their inherent being and the need for at least sovereignty, I don't think you can crush their will just through mass killings or destroying entire cities.
What have they done with their sovereignty? Because it was Hamas who were elected.
No, they haven't. They don't have sovereignty.
They had the vote. They elected Hamas in 2005.
But they don't have a country. I think that's the fundamental issue here, right? Like, you had a previous guest on who said that Hamas had a chance to make Singapore on the Mediterranean. I mean, I don't know if you've been to Singapore, but that's a trading port. Like their economy is based on trade. You can't travel from Gaza. If you're a fisherman that goes beyond a few hundred meters of the sea to fish and feed your family, the Israeli Navy shoots you. All the money that is even provided by Qatar in humanitarian aid has to pass through Israel first. They get to approve every piece of good that goes in and out. It's not a sovereign country.
But there has been billions given in humanitarian aid over many decades. And how has that money been spent? Digging tunnels, weapons, instead of investing in, future prosperity for Gazans.
It's hard to say. I wish I had an opportunity to go to Gaza and verify some of these claims. I've seen a lot of arguments about how all the humanitarian aid goes to weapons, and that they had this opportunity to strive. It's hard for me to see it. I've been to the West Bank. I spent 2 weeks in November 2022 visiting the region. I spent a week with the Israeli government, seeing their perspective, and they take journalists and politicians on a daily basis to kind of provide their point of view. And I spent a week on my own. Some of that I spent with a Israeli human rights group, B'Tselem, and then other days I went by myself to go talk to Israelis and Palestinians on all sides of the debate. I've talked to people from the Israeli government who would make claims that the people in the West Bank had their own sovereignty, and kind of the argument around Gaza that they've had this opportunity to do great things and they just waste it. It's their fault, any of the suffering that they experience. And I've never seen anything like it. Going with any kind of group, you go on these kind of junkets, for lack of a better term, especially as a journalist or as someone in the media, everyone's trying to spin you, right? And it's basically a lot of lies of omission. The Israeli government will say, they'll take you to a place and they'll say, hey, look at this city, and on our first day they said in the city of Lod, the Arabs pulled out a Jew and beat him, and it was terrible, and that's what we have to deal with every day. That's why we need as much security as we require. And then you Google this, and yes, this did happen. But what happened that same week? A Jewish mob killed an Arab citizen. The situation is always more complex. And when I went to the West Bank with the human rights groups, I mean, it's just incredible things. For me as an American, equality under the law and the kind of Enlightenment ideas of being treated based on my actions, not on my identity, are foundational to my worldview. You can walk around parts of Hebron in the West Bank where there are streets where Palestinians are not allowed to walk. There are Palestinian homes where they have to leave out of a window on the back of their building because the front door is part of a segregated street. Going to another kind of small town south, in kind of the center part of the West Bank, near the Susia area, you walk around, you see these Israeli settlements on the hilltops, and they look kind of like an Orange County mini mansion, stuccato rooftops, and they're in relative prosperity. They've got pools, and they're big homes, and at the bottom of the hill are these Palestinian villages where they don't have electricity, they don't have water. The villagers are telling us about how their main source of water is a well, and they're telling us that the Israeli settlers come down from the hill and they put feces and chemicals in their well. And I said, you hear these stories and you assume, okay, maybe I'm just being spun. This is a side with a point of view, and they see a journalist. Maybe they're trying to manipulate me. So, I take them at their word, but walk with them, and I have no idea if they're telling me the truth. And eventually we get to the well, and lo and behold, as we're walking there, a settler comes down from the hill on a dirt bike, and he starts revving his motor aggressively in kind of an intimidating way. It's like, I don't think the Palestinians coordinated with the settler for this episode. It's something they have to deal with every day.
I've actually witnessed very similar things in the West Bank, in Hebron, and I would certainly not deny I'm not that surprised by that. Some of the behavior of the settlers is appalling.
And it's just fundamental that if you're a Jewish baby and you're born in the West Bank in a settlement, you grow up with healthcare, with a quality education. You can eventually vote for the government that oversees you, the military that oversees you. And if you're a Palestinian and you grow up in the West Bank, you can commit the same crime as your Jewish neighbors up in the hills of the settlements, but instead of going to a domestic civilian court, you're tried in a military tribunal. You don't get to vote on the military that oversees you. As a Jewish citizen of the West Bank, you have free speech rights. You can say whatever inflammatory thing you want on the internet, and that's fine. They really do have great protections for free speech in Israel proper. But your own neighbors who are Palestinian, I mean, you've seen these incidents after October 7th. Someone posted a meme with one of the hostages from October 7th. Immediately, a military bulldozer comes and bulldozes their business. Now, I can show you on my phone. I can join Israeli Telegram groups, where people post inflammatory content every day. I just saw a video from Gaza of IDF soldiers feeding a Palestinian body to a group of military dogs, and they've got the smiley emoji and making jokes about it. Are they going to? They shouldn't face any repercussions. They should have free speech rights. But if you post that type of content as a Palestinian, you're sent to prison. There are two standards, and it seems to be based on ethnicity and race. So, fundamental to this conflict is identity. What bothers me here is that when we've had a very long and kind of in-depth debate about how to solve these divides in America. We see the kind of toxic nature of when you divide people based on ethnicity and race and identity here in America, in the West. And in response, we've seen a very kind of admirable push from some on the right and some and many pundits calling for a universal approach, that we should be judged by our conduct, not by our identity. Why is that approach not applied in Israel-Palestine? I think that's the fundamental issue for me here.
Okay, so I think that the big difference is, let's say, you're sort of referring to identity politics in America. It seems to me that in America, identity politics has chosen arbitrary lines to divide, split people up, and then pit people against each other. An obvious example would be saying the use of the capital B Black instead of African American, but capital B Black includes everything from new arrivals from Nigeria to African Americans who have been on this continent for centuries, right? So it doesn't make sense to lump these people together who don't share a culture, they don't share a history particularly. It's almost made up, right? Now, that's not to say there's some commonalities. There are commonalities, but they have a different culture. It's quite different in Israel-Palestine, where there are distinctly different cultures. It's not even necessarily ethnic. It's more ethnos, as in like a history and worldview. And I think you could see, for example, the Hamas Charter, which is explicitly anti-Semitic, even though it was upgraded to be more explicitly anti-Zionist rather than anti-Semitic. But if you go back to the PLO Charter in 1964 as well, it's a similar thing. It's explicitly to get rid of the Zionists and all those Jews not indigenous to that land, i.e. those Jews who had been recent arrivals. So what I would say is that there's a completely different worldview between, I would say, Palestinian Muslims and Israeli Jews or Israelis in the concept of nationhood. And so to put those two people together, to me, it's not identity politics. It's almost like two nations side by side, or rather two nations living on top of each other who have to live together. So it's a different concept.
We had the same view on race relations here in America for almost 100 years. That whites and blacks fundamentally can't get along. That if you put them together, they will rape and kill each other. They need to be separate but equal. That approach didn't work. And when I was in Israel-Palestine, I was shocked by how similar they are. If you actually talk to regular people, Israelis and Arab Palestinians are warm, wonderful people.
I've met some wonderful ones. Yeah.
And I think this attempt by extremist groups on both sides to demand, ethnic sovereignty or domination of the other are deplorable. I can go through the many number of Jewish nationalist groups that use eliminationist rhetoric and violence, and almost they're a mirror image of Hamas. I mean, if you look just at Israel's founding, the Irgun, the Zionist militia that helped break free of British rule, it's the same rhetoric that Hamas uses. The same type of eliminationist rhetoric. And of course, Irgun eventually transformed into Likud. In the Likud's charter, they say from the river to the sea, there will only be Jewish sovereignty. I mean, of course you can pluck this out, but I don't think it actually represents the average Israeli Jewish person or the average Palestinian Arab person in this conflict, to say that they are represented by the worst kind of instincts of their political leaders. I think the average person, whether you're white or black in America, or Jewish or Arab in Israel-Palestine, they want the basic things. They want to live in dignity. They want democratic representation. They want to have a job and education and their kids thrive. They want to be able to retire in dignity. There are extremist forces that want to divide us on race and religion and identity politics, but that's the root of the problem, not the way that we solve it.
But okay, so I'm going to push back on that, right? Because Hamas has gone up in popularity since it's been deemed. Polls suggest that there's approval rating of October 7th is high. I think even a majority amongst Palestinians, both in the West Bank and in Hamas. In Gaza, as far as we can get good polling numbers.
What about in Israel? So there are 2 million people in Gaza, 3 million in the West Bank, and 1.82 million Arab citizens that have democratic rights, that have health care, that have citizenship, that have the basic rights that Jews enjoy. What's happened to them since October 7th? They've pulled that population. They've never felt so patriotic. They've never felt such loyalty to Israel. The foundational issue here is not race or religion or politics. It's the occupation.
So that that notion you're suggesting, I think it's premised of an idea of if you had to all of those people together, it would roughly be 7.5 million Israelis, 7.5 million Arab Muslims, and some other minority groups living in the country. That's a different proposition to what is currently in Israel.
Look, I don't know the solution. If I could wave a magic wand, they would all live together in a multinational state. And let's not forget that there are many other minority populations there. The Druze, they're atheists, they're Christians. They all need to be represented and respected. Let's not pretend that there are only two. But in any case, we've seen this strategy over the last 57 years, since 1967, of subjugation, occupation, violence, blockades, humiliation, killing, torturing, imprisoning people. I would say that maybe it's time to try a new approach. Maybe let's try what's worked in Rwanda. I mean, in Rwanda, people were hacking each other off with machetes. What do they do in Kigali, and what do they do in Rwanda after the genocide? It's now illegal to ask if you're Tutsi or Hutu. They've carefully integrated the population and taken every step possible to sever the attachment to identity politics. They encourage intermarriage. In that 2-week period that I was in Israel-Palestine, I met a group of...
Sorry, I don't accept that that's identity politics.
Well,
because those identity politics is arbitrary lines used for...
These are arbitrary lines.
You think being different between Jews and Muslims is arbitrary?
They're genetically almost the same people.
But genetics is another thing. I'm talking about their
culturally,
their morality systems. It's
I don't think so. You look at the Arab Palestinian parties in the Knesset. Look at their major priorities. It's not war on Jews. They want more police officers for low-income communities. They want more vocational programs for their kids. The average pharmacist in Israel is an Arab Palestinian because they're trying to provide for their family. They're mostly healthcare workers. This idea that they're fundamentally different people is actually my biggest takeaway from visiting the area. You listen to the music, the modern EDM in Hebrew sounds just like Egyptian or Syrian Mizrahi music. It's the same music, it's the same food, it's the same warm culture and the same honor culture too. There's an obsession with the past and getting revenge over the past. And even
I make a case against this.
Please.
Okay, firstly, we had a one-state solution for 30 years. It was the British Mandate, and it was massacre after massacre from 1920, 1921, the famous Hebron massacre in 1929, the Arab uprising, and then in response, as you mentioned, there were some Israeli extremist groups as well, particularly when the British police were not supporting or were being fair. They took the Arab side in all of those small things. We found in 30 years, not only was it a disaster to have these two populations together, the British thought it was such a disaster and such a waste of money, they were like, oh, fuck this, we're out of here. And they bolted because they knew it was just a thankless, tireless, and extremely expensive job to police two people who didn't want to work together. So we tried 30 years.
Of an outside empire imposing its will. I'm saying that there should be no outside empire.
They were just managing and policing it.
Well, it's still an outside empire imposing its will. Outside empires imposing their will across the world has not worked. Just as the Irgun blew up cafes and buses and attacked British officers, famously strung two up and booby-trapped their body. I mean, the same type of Hamas-style tactics the Zionist militias engaged in when they were striving for their own sovereign state. We see this across the world. This is what happened in Afghanistan when the U.S. tried to impose its will. This is what happened in Vietnam.
So let's say your idea, or the hope for peace of a one-state solution. Okay.
No, I'm saying I don't know. I don't want to be prescriptive. I don't know if a one-state solution is possible. If I could wave a magic wand, sure. But I just know that people need sovereignty, whether that's sovereignty in one state, two state, three states, I don't know. But they can't live in permanent occupation and permanent humiliation.
Okay.
Just as like if the tables were turned, right? If this was a Arab Muslim ethno-state and there was a population of Jewish people living, in a very small segregated territory surrounded by walls, surrounded with machine guns facing inwards, that every 2 or 3 years is bombed, that lacks basic sanitation, that can't engage in trade and are basically stateless people, I would make the same argument, right? Like they need sovereignty, whether that's a single state or a separate state. The occupation is the issue. And the fact that...
But I don't think it is the occupation issue, because it strikes me that the popular view is that they reject that there should be even non-indigenous, to use their words, Jews there in the first place.
When Hamas was first elected in 2006, they sent a communique to George Bush saying that they would accept the 1967 borders. They would accept peace. Were they genuine in that? I don't know. There's been a long history of tit for tat and cycles of violence. Even in the creation of Hamas and the Muslim Brotherhood, the support it received from Israel in its early days, that the Wall Street Journal and others have reported on this in detail, and many Israeli commanders who once supervised the Gaza Strip have been very clearly on the record that Israel intentionally promoted Hamas to kill a two-state solution, that as the PLO gave up its arms, gave up fighting, and said we're ready to come to the table for peace, as a way to undercut peace, the Israeli military promoted the Muslim Brotherhood, promoted Hamas. They funded their extremist mosque. They would arrest only the secular and nationalist leaders and allow the kind of Muslim Brotherhood Hamas leaders to go and proselytize. This is a very documented history. And as Netanyahu himself and other Likud leaders have said, Hamas has been a useful strategy for them to undermine a two-state solution and keep the Palestinians divided. Now, that strategy has blown up. It's harmed a lot of people. Maybe the solution is to stop dividing and conquering and occupying and blockading, and to come together and treat people respectfully. Like what have the Palestinians received in terms of Fatah and the PLO from laying down their arms and recognizing Israel? Were they given a state? Were they given mutual respect? If you're a Palestinian, you're wondering, okay, there's a couple political paths ahead of me. The PLO in the late 80s, early 90s gave up their weapons. They recognized Israel and gave up violent resistance. And what did they get in return? They get they get treated like cattle in the West Bank where they have power. They're treated as subhuman. So, or do you go towards the kind of robust fighters that engage in horribly anti-Semitic rhetoric with Hamas? It's not shocking that people gravitate towards that when the peaceful attempts, the folks who have given up their arms, have gotten nothing in return.
Okay, so forgive me if I backtrack a second, but just help me. Why I think I've got a different take on this is that, like, the idea that sovereignty is all they want. I'm not sure I would either be convinced by that, or sure I could persuade any Israeli that that's the case, because if you look at the various opportunities where there's been the opportunity for sovereignty, let's say the 1936 Peel Commission, or 1947, and then when the British pulled out in 1948, and then various points onwards from that, even if they, let's say, accepted the territory, which they never do, if they accepted the territory, it seems to me that the ideology is that they think that the whole territory is theirs, and so that they would then, I just wouldn't believe that there would be a Palestinian state where they wouldn't want to attack and try and reclaim. So they would take the sovereignty, but then they would build up arms to try and recapture the whole land. And I don't understand. Or rather, if I was running Israel, I would certainly not take the risk that that's what was going to happen.
Well, Winston, I think this is where we fundamentally disagree here, because They've already taken the risk. You know, we haven't tried peace. They haven't tried giving them a state. They've tried just this strategy of blockades and occupation, and it's made everyone less safe. Made everyone, I think, more miserable. I mean, I don't see how you could look at the last 40 years and defend it. And there's this claim that they've been offered a state over and over again. They've never been offered a true state. A state has control of its borders. They were given some.
They have been offered a true state.
No, not a state, because they said they couldn't have their own military, their own control of their border, their own control of their airspace. That's not a state. I mean, do you consider the Navajo in America their own state? They have some, autonomy. They have casinos, but they don't have their own military. I mean, the foundation of a state is a military, and they were never given that. They were never granted that or offered that. So,
Was that not the case in 1947? I actually don't know the answer to that question.
Well, I don't want to go into the. Yeah, let's not go into that. But
why not?
Well, I think when part of this becomes like a pedantic debate because they're comparing notes between two different negotiators, and I don't want to. I'm sure your commenters will fact check both of us. We've gotten some things wrong, but over the broad strokes, over the last 40 years, a true state hasn't been offered, and I think that's foundational. I think this is. And I don't want to speak in circles here, but the big takeaway is that they're the same people.
I just can't accept that they're the same people.
But we had this debate in America.
But it's completely different.
It's no different. Well, I mean, human beings are the same.
But I'll tell you why it's a different debate in America. And you're referring...
And there's big cultural divisions between all the different ways you can slice and dice race in America. Sure. But that doesn't mean that we need to be treated differently under the law.
But the difference is that in America, assuming you mean white and black populations...
White, black, Chinese, Latino.
But did any group ever think that another group should be expelled from the country?
We've had violent rhetoric. I mean, there were...
Sure, there's extremism on both sides.
Yeah, there's lust for revenge in the black nationalist tradition.
But the
there's a lust for expelling and mass murdering blacks from the white supremacist tradition. And that was actually a very mainstream part of the discourse. There was a whole send them back to Africa movement, here in New York City in the early 20th century. That has been part of our we've had eliminationist demagogues on both sides, and mass lynching and mass violence. Now, of course, there are factual differences between the comparison, but I'm saying fundamentally what solved our really horrible racial history of going back 400 years of chattel slavery, of mass rape, and we don't have to go through all the details of racial oppression in this country. Just treating people as equal, forgetting the past, intermarrying, and creating families. That's what creates lasting peace. It wasn't that long ago where my family, I'm half white. I have family from rural Virginia. My mom remembers a time when there were race riots in her high school where people bitterly hated each other. You go back to those communities now, it's impossible to imagine. Things can change on a dime. And, what spooked me about, I had a lot of very, very interesting experiences in Israel-Palestine. I talked to one Palestinian journalist who's from East Jerusalem. He had a Jewish girlfriend. There's a group called Lahava that it's kind of like a gang. They go around and they intimidate and beat people up who engage in inter-identity relationships. And that's exactly what happened. He got a flood of threats. There were violent threats against him if he didn't stop dating his girlfriend. I mean, there's an attempt by the extremists to separate people, to not see our common humanity. And unfortunately, you have a lot of very well-funded, very extremist people in America that fuel some of the hatred by funding a lot of these think tanks and hate groups that encourage us to not see each other as fully human and not find common cause. The more people get together, they play on the same sports teams, they break bread and have dinner together, the more that they form relationships and families, they find common ground. That's how we solve the race issue in America, and that's fundamentally how I see the race issue being solved in Israel-Palestine.
I don't think it's a race issue,
whatever you want to call it, the identity issue. I mean, Israel treats it as a race, right? You can be an atheist but have a grandmother or grandfather who has identified as Jewish and receive Israeli citizenship, right? But you can be born as a Palestinian within the borders of Israel and not have citizenship, right? Isn't that treating it as a race? In any case, I don't know. What is the solution then? I'm at a loss because I hear people saying, no, we've got to annihilate the Hamas leadership. And okay, sure, kill all the Hamas leadership. Then what? What do you do with the people in the West Bank? What do you do with the people in Gaza? How do you create an enduring peace?
Okay, so this is where we might find some agreement, right? So back to the specific issue. The specific war right now. You say it was ethnic slaughter, and I tried to push you, if you were running Israel, what to do. Now, from my point of view, as long as there are hostages in Gaza, Israel needs to get them back.
Sure.
Right. And I would say there's even amongst Israeli population, they're not completely convinced that the current strategy is going to get their hostages back for good reason, because it really might not get their hostages back. But let's say I was running Britain and the Germans came in and took 200 hostages. It'd be like, well, we're going to do what we have to do to get those hostages back. It's like an obligation. So there's one aspect is a hostage, and then the bit where I fall, where it's maybe we would agree, which is that if the aim is to eliminate an ideology, i.e. Hamas ideology, it's not convincing to me with this specific war that that's achievable. It's almost like a Chinese finger trap where the more you struggle, the more you prove the ideology correct. And so even if they wiped out many of the Hamas militants and the battalions, as they have been doing, if you to believe IDF numbers, I think they've destroyed something like 16 or even have actually written it down, 19 of 24 battalions so far. There's some sense of progress in that sense. But even if you wiped out all of the militants, all of the battalions, and even if you got rid of the Hamas leadership who are in Qatar, that ideology remains amongst the people, because they're just going to see that their people have been killed. So they're not going to suddenly turn over. Now, the response to that might be, well, that's what happened in Nazi Germany or whatever. But I'm not totally convinced that applies here. Do we have common ground on that opinion or not really? Do you just...
Yeah, I agree. And I really cringe at people who invoke World War II.
Why?
Well, actually, let me back up. I agree with all of that. The one thing is that one part of this conflict is that I see a double standard in the way that people talk about certain forms of violence. What is terror? What is killing a civilian? Why is it only when a Palestinian kills a civilian a form of terror? Why is it not when an Israeli or Zionist group kills a civilian? Is that a form of terror? What is a hostage? Is a hostage? There are 4,000 or so, I believe the number has changed, Palestinians who have been taken without charges who sit in Israeli jails. Are those hostages?
Well, I don't know those individual cases. But as far as when I've looked into it, it's because they've committed crimes.
No, there are thousands without any charges. Either they should be charged or let go, right? So anyways, let's get back to what you were saying about World War II. In World War II, there was the creation of a state in both Japan and Germany. There was an influx of money and technical knowledge. And in fact, many of the Nazis were not prosecuted or even killed. They pledged allegiance to a new state and disavowed their Nazi past, and they became part of civil society. They became the bankers and businessmen and even the politicians in many cases. And Germany was allowed to trade with the world and reconstitute its military. For the folks who have invoked World War II, how many of them are calling for any of those policy solutions for Palestine, giving them a state, giving them a military, giving a path for a denazification or a de-Hamasification? We did the same thing in Iraq. After the kind of failures of the first few years of the occupation of Iraq and the Civil War, there was the de-Baathification process that went horribly wrong of removing too many Saddam supporters where the country fell into chaos. And there was the Anbar awakening saying, hey, former Sunni tribal leaders, come back into government. Let's make sure that everyone's represented at the table, no matter your past, as long as you're committed to a positive future state for Iraq. Is that on the table? Is that what Israeli politicians have proposed? I haven't seen it once. They want to invoke World War II in terms of destroying Dresden, but they don't want to invoke World War II for what happened after.
For me, it would come back to not I just, it comes back down to the ideology rather than the identity, and that it would be hard to.
Well, it's like,
I don't know how you could trust the other side.
You could say the same about Vietnam. Like, you look at the history of it. In the early '60s, there were suicide bombings on cafes. There were, massive efforts to build tunnels all throughout the country to infiltrate civilian centers and blow themselves up at cafes because they were striving for sovereignty. And you look at the rhetoric from the U.S. military. Over and over again, we were told that the Vietnamese don't respect human life. That this is the communist ideology, that they simply want to destroy the West and they hate everything that we represent. Well, what happened after we left? The bombing stopped. The Vietnamese people actually did want sovereignty. There's an attempt by any occupying military power to be reductive about any rebellion or subjugated people, and to simplify their demands, to say these are people who love hatred, who love violence, who don't care about human life, and that's why they'll go to the extreme step of using bombs. Now, again, I don't accept any violence against civilians. Hamas should release the hostages. I don't agree with any of their ideology, but this is a very kind of simplistic way to look at the conflict when you see that if you refuse to recognize that the occupation is the root cause. And I think the fact that the 1.82 million Palestinians who have citizenship, who have rights, have turned away from Hamas after October 7th, they're even more patriotic. The issue is the occupation.
So I'm not saying that the occupation doesn't, or I use that term probably differently from you, but the current setup, let's say, isn't, it's certainly not ideal. We can both agree on that, and it's making things worse. But I wouldn't accept that that's the foundation reason for the conflict. I think that the foundation goes back to the difference between the two groups in accepting what's going on. So from the Arab side, the Palestinian side, that they would accept Jews there at all. I think that that's one of the fundamental differences. And then I also don't accept that there can be any setup where they really live peacefully together. So I don't think it's an occupation. It's just two nations who can't be squared.
Yeah, I just don't know how we solve this without some form of integration. And again, look at the Palestinian political parties in the Knesset. They're very normal. Like they just like their demands are more police officers, more funding for vocational jobs.
Yeah, but okay. So the difference would be then, at the moment, what I have written these numbers down, but it's something like 1.5-2 million Muslims in Israel, proper Israel,
right,
and 5.5 million Jews or something like that. Or no, it's 7, I think.
Yes, it's a little over 7.
It would be a completely different story if there were 7 million Muslims and 7 million Israelis both vying for the same plot of land, which we have tried before, and now I feel like I'm going back in circles a little bit.
Yeah, but, and I apologize. I don't mean to bring it too much into a circle, but I guess this is the foundational issue. And again, I will just say, look back at the American South. In places like Mississippi, South Carolina, Louisiana, after the Civil War, blacks outnumbered whites in many communities. There was a fear that there would be, after 300 years of brutal subjugation, there would be retribution if they gave people democracy. And indeed, if you look at the kind of history of reconciliation, because of course there are ugly periods of race riots and violence, but there are a lot of beautiful periods after the Civil War where people did come together and start forming relationships.
I don't think it's a question of revenge, although I'm not rejecting that there is revenge involved. But I'm saying, okay, so those African Americans, and they were at least all Christians, right? So they had a similar worldview, even though they had a hugely different history. And that's not the same. So, it's kind of what is a nation, for example? Like,
I mean, they lived in circumstances
you'd have to give an example of a nation that has it is split in half with two drastically different worldviews, religions, and yet shares a country.
Well, there are many countries around the world that have different religions where there's
always harmony. There's always a majority ethnos.
I don't know. I don't know if religion is the only aspect here. There are people of the same religion who kill each other in countries.
Of course, but it's not just a religion, because a religion brings a moral structure. It brings it's a shared heritage. It's kind of the code of interacting each other. It's a worldview. It's even if you have different religions, you have a different concept of reality. You literally see things differently. And not only that, I would say that in Islam, fundamentalists, well, actually, literal Quran, in literal scripture, it's very anti-Semitic, and so I'm not totally convinced that those religions are particularly simpatico in the first place.
I mean, what about in America? We all get along here, and
It's
we
like
don't
80% Christian.
Well, there are parts of this country that are not 80% Christian, and people get along fine because we have equality under the law. We have basic Enlightenment values here, where people are treated equally regardless of their identity, race, religion, what have you. And the issue for me is when you start dividing and saying, this is a country only for one ethnic group, then you invariably create an outgroup that becomes the scapegoat when there's a political crisis.
It's for one ethnic group because they've got a minority that they're not expelling. The problem I'm saying is that there's a certain balance.
There's a minority they're refusing to integrate for the reasons you just enumerated. They don't want a situation where Palestinians are even 50% of the population. And just in terms of your question, look at Turkey. Turkey, after the disintegration of the Ottoman Empire, it reconstituted itself instead of as a multi-ethnic, multi-religious empire as an ethno-state, a Turkish ethno-state. What happens when there's a Turkish ethno-state? Well, it doesn't even matter for Kurds who are a majority Muslim. If they aren't ethnically Turkey, they've been discriminated against because they don't have the basic Enlightenment values of equality under the law, that regardless of our religion or ethnic group, that we should be treated the same. Identity.
I'm not making that suggestion. I want those Enlightenment values,
but religion is just another marker for identity. And it can be the foundation for culture. But in Turkey and other parts of the Middle East, you have people who are both Muslim, even part of the same Muslim sect, both Sunni, who hate each other because of ethnic tribe. Once you create a society that upholds one ethnic tribe over the other, that's the issue.
So let's say how would you have, if you were to integrate all people living in the territory of West Bank, Gaza, East Jerusalem, and Israel into one group, you honestly think it would? Isn't that a utopian progressive worldview? That you honestly think that they would get along?
It's what we have in the rest of the West. We have it in Denmark. We don't
have a split.
We do have it in the United States, in France, in Spain.
But there's a majority group, and I'm not talking about ethnicity. I'm not talking about race, because I believe in.
Well, the majority group
in sharing, it's not on ethnic grounds. My family is very multi. It would be a disaster for me to not support a multi-ethnic society. My point is that I think that a country can't hold if it doesn't have a majority that has a worldview and then accepts tolerance around that. I'm not saying that everyone has to suddenly prescribe to the prevailing religion, but you have to prescribe some amount you have to assimilate. And we're seeing this in my country, in Britain. We're having mass immigration, 700,000 net a year, and what's the result is we have people we're bringing in who don't believe in democracy, people we're bringing in who don't believe in equality, who even this year we've had it where threatening MPs and politicians with their life. We've had MPs murdered. So it's not apparent to me that different groups can easily fit in, because different groups have different conceptions of reality and justice in the world.
Europe is not as good at integrating people as America. It's our superpower.
It is your superpower.
Within less than one generation, people see themselves as American when they come here.
But America's the anomaly. It's the only one.
Canada too. I don't know.
Yeah, I'm okay. Maybe Canada as well.
Yeah. I don't really understand the European mind and why they do so poorly at integrating people. I suspect, actually, though, it's this.
But it's not just the European mind. It's all other nations apart from America and Canada. Oh no, maybe South America. It would.
Yeah, I don't
but
know. I mean, look at Central America. That's actually an interesting area where, just as like Chinese are kind of seen as the banking elite, as the minority in Southeast Asia, it's Palestinians and Lebanese who are the elite of Central America. The president of El Salvador is ethnically Palestinian, formerly the wealthiest man of Honduras, Miguel Facuse, again ethnically Palestinian. They've integrated really well there, and it's like this claim that societies can't integrate. It's a self-fulfilling prophecy if you obsess over our ethnic differences. If you find more common ground with people.
I know, but I'm not obsessing about ethnic differences. I'm obsessing about fundamental worldview differences. And that worldview includes on both sides the opinion that the other group can't be there. So not only that they shouldn't be there, at the extremes, but also that they're terrified and both sides have good reason that if they are mixed together, their own place in Israel is in that territory, in that land, is under threat, and their own lives are under threat, as has been the case historically. I keep going back to the British Mandate when we actually had that experiment, but also now there's even less trust. So, for me, that's quite a utopian concept to try and put everyone
right now we have a dystopian attempt. We have a dystopian world where people are separated and encouraged to hate each other. In Israeli schools, in Jewish schools, they've discouraged the teaching of Arabic. They don't want kids talking to each other. There are increasing efforts to break up families that are mixed. That scares me because maybe you could call it utopian, but I think it works very well here in America and other parts of the world. The only way out of this is to see each other as fully human, to understand that we have more in common once we get to know each other, once we form families and relationships, once we work together, once we respect each other as equals. And the attempts by the extremists on both sides to sever that, to caricature the other, to assume bad faith in every interaction, that's the fundamental problem.
Yeah, well, the problem I had, sorry, I don't want to go round and round in circles, but the problem I have with that is that I don't think that's, even within Islam, I don't think that's totally possible. Fundamentalism, if you read the scripture, they don't accept other groups as equal. So there's always going to be a difficulty there.
Look, I'm not here to defend Islam. I feel like my experience with religion here in America is very positive because our assimilationist power is that it moderates everyone. I know a lot of Muslims, I know a lot of Jews, and none of them subscribe to the eliminationist view that extremists in Israel-Palestine use. No one. Benjamin Netanyahu and his military leadership and political leadership invoking Amalek, this biblical prophecy about killing every man, woman, child, donkey, cow of the enemy of the Jews before they go into Gaza. That scares me because I don't know any Jews who talk that way here in America. And I see Islamists in that region who use horrible anti-Semitic speech about stoning the Jew, this type of terrible rhetoric. I see it online, but I don't see it in America because we find more in common with each other. We live in integrated communities and we don't stress our identity. That's what makes America great.
In Britain, unfortunately, there are Muslims who are very openly talking about taking over Britain and it to turn into an Islamic country. And they talk about it very openly online. And because essentially I think that Islam is a colonialist project.
Yeah.
So it's that's a significant part of
I reject all this rhetoric. I think this is another area where we find common ground here. You look at some of these pro-Palestinian protests, they use such exaggerated rhetoric, extremist rhetoric, that this is a project not only to get rid of Israeli occupation of what have you, but all of America is occupied by a colonial force, and that October 7th was this wonderful moment to throw off the yoke of oppression in America, and it should be emulated. Of course, there are extremists on all sides, and I find it disgusting. I also find it weird. There are protesters who say that we are actually on Turtle Island because it's the Native American term for North America, and that we're not really in the United States of America. There's silly extremist stuff. And there are Christian nationalists who say that they don't believe in the Constitution, that we should be a theology, we should be ruled by biblical law, and that they're willing to engage in violence to enact it here in America. Those people do exist. But again, I think, at least here, and I can't speak on the UK because I don't follow it as closely as you do, they're at the fringes. And there are politicians on both sides that elevate the fringes, both in terms of short-term political expediency and to demonize the other side.
It's not in Britain. It's not okay. In Britain, seeing you brought it up, according to the Henry Jackson Society recent poll, 76% of British Muslims, and there are 4 million British Muslims, think that October 7th didn't happen, or don't accept what happened on October 7th. And there's a very high support of Hamas amongst British Muslims. So it's now, but British Muslims are only 4 million of a 60 million, 65 million population. So you would say that's fringe, but within certain groups, it's not. So that's
that's an alarming number.
Yeah.
No disagreement there.
Seeing as we're on America, I'm interested in asking you about the campus stuff. What we're seeing on campus, up in what I would call Gaza Plaza up the road, and Columbia University, because you had a rather popular tweet comparing what the police force used at Columbia to what had similar things had happened during the Vietnam War. I'm quite interested in this because there's also, as we spoke on our last conversation, podcast conversation rather, about the trouble you got in reporting on the BLM riots. And so I'm interested in the different approaches to these different riots happening. You did not like, or it seemed to me you did not like, you thought it was hypocritical how those students are being treated right now up on American university campuses by the state. Have I understood that correctly?
It seemed, and I was not there for the police removal of the students, but from what I gathered, the reporting and the videos, it seemed disproportionate in terms of the police response.
What should have been done? Okay, let me ask the question differently. One of the problems in the 2020 riots, which you covered, was that there wasn't enough policing. And so we had a lot of people killed, a lot of businesses were damaged.
Yes.
And not only that, because the media elites, as well as the political elites, tended to support it, they didn't report it. Some people, I seem to remember, if they did report against the narrative,
downplayed it.
Yeah. So why do you not think with this case that it's good that there's more police? The students are trespassing, and some data suggests that its majority aren't even students; they're just people there protesting on these private campuses. I accept that not all of them are private. University of Texas is state land that the encampments have been built on. At what point is it legitimate to take these trespassers off campus? At what point is it an infringement on free speech?
Well, I think this is just a very different set of circumstances, and I'll say this. In the Bay Area alone, I walked through San Francisco Chinatown. Almost every other store was smashed or looted. I went to Oakland Chinatown across the Bay Bridge. There's a Chinese restaurant where I was married, and it's in a plaza of Chinese senior citizen homes, pharmacies, restaurants, jewelry shops, grocery shops. Every single one of them smashed, robbed. The day I was walking around interviewing people in Oakland, someone had driven a car into a gun shop, to smash into a gun shop and steal the guns. They were stopped. The next afternoon, because so many police were diverted from local suburban communities in the East Bay to protect shops and protect people in San Francisco and Oakland, our two biggest cities in the Bay Area, along with San Jose. In one small working class community in San Leandro, there were something like 6 hours of sustained looting, an entire shopping mall gutted. They broke into the Dodge dealership, the car dealership, and stole 80 cars. They were driven into buildings. They were spun off onto the highway. They were driven around to commit crimes all over the Bay Area. Now, I don't disagree that there has been law breaking with these student protests. But it's hard to see the comparison. If they engaged in any level of criminality and mass violence and looting, and as you mentioned, people were killed during these riots. Private security officers, people were killed in the fracas of these mass riots that were enveloping cities all across America. Yes, there should be more of a police response. But that's not what I'm seeing here on student campuses. There's some silly rhetoric. There's some extremist rhetoric. But nothing that demands, what looked like almost 1,000 officers clearing everyone, including people engaged in protected speech. You might not agree with the protesters, but historically they've had a right to the quad, to the open air kind of fields in almost every major university, as historically, at least in America, free speech zones where people can communicate their various beliefs. And I did compare it in a tweet to the 1985 apartheid protests on Columbia, where for 3 weeks students chained themselves to the same building, set up tents in the same campus. Again, there were outsiders who joined, students from all over the New York area, and some people who were not even students joined the encampments. In many ways, it was very similar. The political dynamics were different. In April 1985, the same month that the students were chaining themselves to that building, the U.S. House started passing sanctions against the apartheid regime in South Africa, penalizing companies that did business with South Africa. Reagan and his administration were beginning to change their tune. And at that time, Columbia University's in-house counsel was Floyd Abrams, the famous First Amendment attorney who's gone on and fought many important First Amendment cases. He negotiated in a respectful way with the protesters. Eventually, many of the protesters were arrested and charged and disciplined. But it wasn't this mass removal of students. It was not this kind of ultra-militarized police, coming in on these armored vehicles response. And I think that relates to the political dynamics. What had happened in the last month in Congress? Were there any penalties or sanctions to Israel? No. There was another vote for $9 billion in additional weapons. There's a passage of a bill that attempts to penalize students for criticizing the state of Israel, the Anti-Semitism Awareness Act. The political dynamics are entirely different because you have this very powerful lobby group that is Christian Zionists, conservatives, Jewish pro-Israel activists as a coalition working together to support Israel and to shut down any criticism of Israel. Now, I will say that we've had actually an insufficient police response in some places. Right, like we saw the fighting between pro-Israel and pro-Palestinian groups at UCLA. Where were the police there? The police should have come in and established law and order. That was 2 weeks ago at UCLA. Both sides attacking each other. The pro-Israel groups throwing fireworks into the crowd of pro-Palestinian students. People being dragged out and beaten. Student journalists being beaten by a mob. We should have had more police there. Right, like the police need to play an appropriate, careful role where they don't abridge and violate our free speech rights. That they tread carefully around, valued traditions around civil disobedience, but that they don't allow any type of law breaking where a civilian or outsider is hurt, where any kind of business is needlessly vandalized, or any kind of damage where human life is at risk. That's what I'm saying, and it's not easy for the police. I sympathize for their role. They're being goaded on by all sides. There are groups that are kind of national security groups that are trying to encourage more police crackdowns by claiming that all these student protesters are supporters of terrorism. They're trying to use national security grounds to pressure the police. I'm sure these school administrators don't want to have to deal with these protesters, so they're encouraging the police. And oftentimes, they're placed in a tough spot. So, and I don't want to say that they're a monolith either. America is big and diverse. We have thousands of different police jurisdictions operating under different rules. Cops are often strained dealing with violent crime in society, and the fact that they need to be pulled off the beat to cover these protests, I'm sure is also stressful. I don't want to simplify the situation, and I think the problem with Twitter is that you want to make a poignant point, but you can sometimes lose context with what you're pointing out.
Do you think there are other hypocrisies that you've seen that have changed since the October 7th in America, where certain people are throwing away the principles? It's actually how the very beginning of this conversation. I'm quite curious to hear more of those. Free speech seems to be one of them. We've almost hinted at the identity politics aspect.
Yeah, I mean, the identity politics is problematic because it's really like the same intellectual foundations for the kind of Black Lives Matter extremism that we saw is now being applied to pro-Israel Jewish voices, where you take a minority that has been historically discriminated against, that's suffered extreme levels of structural violence and discrimination, and you apply it to everyday interactions, and you have this kind of bigotry inflation where people start seeing bigotry in every normal interaction. In 2020, latching on to George Floyd and other accusations and incidents, people started seeing racism behind every corner, that drinking milk was white supremacist, or the okay sign with your hand was a sign that you're a white supremacist. And every time, a black and white person interacted or had a disagreement online or in a workplace, that suddenly that was structural racism. And it got out of hand to a point where it became part of a public and mass hysteria in America. We're seeing something very similar now, where
no one's saying that milk or the countryside is anti-Semitic.
There were claims that milk was was racist. Now, milk, no, we haven't seen that level.
But
we see this.
My point is that it's not the same.
It's very similar.
Back then, everything was racist.
We've had members of Congress meet with a young pro-Israel activist who claimed that she was jousted in the eye with a Palestinian flag, that she was stabbed in the eye. She toured the whole media, television, newspaper, online media is obsessed with this. Once the video comes out, a tap on the shoulder. It's the same level of safetyism, of we're under attack and we've got to inflate every perceived harm, every perceived disagreement as motivated by bigotry. We see this almost every day with, anything I wrote in 2020 that said, hey, look, there might be a negative externality of depolicing. If we abolish the police, maybe more black people will be killed because of the levels of violence that we see in some communities. Instantly, you get accused of being a racist, stigmatized as a racist. Criticize any of Israel's conduct today, your inbox and your mentions are flooded with claims that you're an anti-Semite. It feels very similar.
I mean, I've seen some of it used to shut down debate, but I don't think it's comparable. It's like there's Mike Moynihan made a joke that on his podcast that you can literally Google anything you want is racist and an article will come up. It's not quite the same scale where it's like absolutely everything.
No, you're right. There's a cultural difference in terms of the people mass producing is racist accusations were very spread, but there's a balance to that in the sense that as much as people, mass manufactured accusations of anti-black racism in 2020 and anti-Asian eventually and anti-trans, it just started spiraling. We didn't see Congress moving to create new laws to change the Civil Rights Act to prosecute protected speech, right? It's not just the Anti-Semitism Awareness Act.
Anti-Semitism?
Yeah, we've seen similar bills and laws proposed and actually enacted in Georgia, South Carolina, South Dakota, Florida, where they're modifying hate speech codes to add additional criminal penalties for speech that's certain forms of speech against Israel. I mean, that never happened with Black Lives Matter. We weren't proposing changes to our statute to put people into jail for criticizing Black Lives Matter, but we're seeing that in our legislatures around the country. So you're right, it's not an exact comparison, but in terms of the public hysteria manifesting into material changes in our law.
We've got the same thing in Britain where there's APPG, All-Party Parliamentary Group, who have a definition of Islamophobia, which includes criticizing Islam.
Yeah.
And the Labour Party, who are about to become our next government, have accepted that terminology. It seems that very similar to, if you read the Anti-Semitism Awareness Act, it includes some things about Israel, we're like, that's not anti-Semitic, it's just criticism of Israel. Now, listeners can look it up for themselves and see the exact details, but it's certainly alarming, and it seems to me to go against American free speech principles, and I don't quite understand how it's all got through. It seems bizarre to me that both left and right, as you said at the beginning of this conversation, we've seen for the last 10 years, and particularly through COVID, democratic government working against free speech in America, but it seems to me that's coming from the right as well. So it's
a human condition. We've associated with the left, and there may be certain pathologies with the left that make it more likely in certain instances. But ultimately, we're fragile and intellectually hypocritical and weak in certain ways. When political partisans of either side see advantage in a crisis, they will weaponize accusations of bigotry, and they will be hypocritical on issues of free speech. It's very rare to have true stalwarts of this principle to defend the right of free speech for your opponents in a crisis. And we saw this, I saw so many liberals who had claimed to support free speech and claimed to support the First Amendment, abandoning it in 2020 when they saw a crisis and they saw a political opportunity. And we're seeing conservatives do the exact same thing today.
So we're on a note where we agree, which is a lovely way to bring this conversation to an end. But before I do, I want to ask, because we moved on from Israel-Palestine, is there anything that you feel like you'd actually like to address from this conversation that you didn't get to finish any thoughts through?
No, and I appreciate that, Winston. What I want to say is that I appreciate what you're doing here. It's tough to have these conversations, and I don't want to pretend that I have all the solutions. I have certain first principles that I'm attempting to defend and I'm attempting to apply to complex policy issues where there are a lot of facts, there are a lot of circumstances. This is also happening in a foreign country where it's hard to do the day-to-day reporting. But these conversations, I think, are pivotal. So I'm glad you did this, and it was good to speak to you.
Great to you. I feel like we might have had a somewhat constructive conversation, which is great, and I thank you for that, and I thank you for having just coming to speak on the show, and I'm sure listeners will have lots of opinions. But as I said at the beginning, I found it very difficult to find pro-Palestinian voices. So thank you for bringing some diversity of opinion, which I'm very keen for on the show. And you've got a huge Substack, leefang.com, leefung.com, forgive me. Is there anything else you would like to direct listeners and viewers to, anything that they can follow your work? And anything you're particularly excited about, maybe?
No, not really. I cover a lot of diverse subjects, civil liberties, money and politics. I'm excited to write about this presidential campaign.
You're excited, are you?
Well, I'm not excited to vote in it, but it's going to be an interesting one. So,
who do you think's better for Palestinians, Biden or Trump?
Well, here's an interesting area where I have absolutely no idea. The leadership of both political parties came together for the military support of Israel, for passage of this Anti-Semitism Awareness Act. In terms of their statements, there's not a lot of daylight between Trump and Biden, or even RFK on Israel issues. But you never know. I mean, I'm hopeful that after the election, the candidates can be more forthright. But unfortunately, we've got many months for this issue to be stigmatized. I think neither of them want to talk about it in a nuanced way. They just want to kind of galvanize voters. So this is going to stretch on for a long time.
Do you have an opinion on the Abraham Accords?
Look, I want normalization. I think it's a net positive if countries communicate, if people exchange ideas and engage in trade. I think that's one of the few positive, big accomplishments out of the Trump administration.
You're complimenting Trump. Lee Fang, you're in trouble.
But it's also a tragedy in the sense that they were able to do this by getting around the Palestinian issue, but pretending it didn't exist. But it does exist, and someone's got to solve it. I strongly believe that the only way to solve it is through a political resolution. And I don't know. I'm not optimistic about that coming anytime soon, but we'll see.
Oh, well, let's not live on some pessimistic note. We're almost on optimistic note. But anyway, Lee Fang, thank you for speaking with me. It's been a great pleasure.
Thanks for having me, Winston.
Thank you for watching and listening to The Winston Marshall Show with me, Winston Marshall. Remember, if you want to support me, all you have to do is press subscribe. Press that subscribe button and I can have more wonderful guests discussing the important issues that you want to hear about.